Imagine a small rain-soaked town hidden away in the Pacific Northwest, Aberdeen, Washington. And in this town, in a modest home surrounded by towering evergreens, a boy named Kurt Cobain was born on February 20th, 1967. Little did anyone know that this quiet, often gloomy place would help shape one of the most iconic figures of the 90s grunge movement. But the story of Kurt Cobain is not a simple one of fame and fortune. It's a tale with deep-rooted pain, raw talent, and a tragic end that left millions mourning a lost legend.
Like, subscribe. Thank you.
Kurt Cobain grew up in Aberdeen, a place that has seen better days. It was a logging town on the decline, and the sense of fading hope seemed to seep into everything, including Kurt's life. His dad, Donald, was a mechanic, and his mom, Wendy, worked as a waitress. They didn't have much, but they made do. Despite their struggles, Kurt's early years were, by most accounts, pretty good. He was a bright kid, full of energy, and from a young age, he was already showing signs of what would become a lifelong love for music. He'd belt out Beatles songs around the house, charm the neighbors with his singing, and find inspiration in the melodies of the Monkees and Electric Light Orchestra. His family noticed that he had that artistic spark from early on, not just in his love for music, but also in his passion for drawing. His grandmother, who was an artist herself, would encourage young Kurt, giving him a place to let his creativity run wild. For a while it seemed like maybe Kurt would have a relatively happy, if modest, childhood. But that was before the walls started closing in. In 1979, Kurt was just 11 years old when his parents divorced. And for Kurt, it was like the ground beneath his feet had crumbled away. The family he had known was suddenly split apart, and Kurt, a sensitive, emotional kid, felt like he was being torn in half. He was shuffled back and forth between his mom and dad, never really feeling like he belonged anywhere. And this sense of abandonment, being out of place, would stay with Kurt for the rest of his life. But as he grew older, that pain would find its way into his music, turning his raw talent into something powerful, something that spoke to the lost and the broken. And this is where the roots of Kurt Cobain's artistry and his struggles began. Aberdeen was a place that seemed to echo his own feelings of frustration and longing. And it was from this setting that Kurt would eventually emerge, guitar in hand, ready to pour every ounce of his anger, sadness, and hope into the music that would define a generation. At first, young Kurt liked his new stepmother, Jenny Westerby, enjoying the attention that she gave him. But that feeling didn't last. With new step-siblings and a half-brother in the mix, Kurt began to feel like he was being pushed aside. And on his mom's side, things were even darker. Wendy's new relationship was marked by domestic violence, and young Kurt was caught in the middle of the chaos. It was a recipe for emotional turmoil that would only deepen as he got older. Kurt Cobain's teenage years were anything but stable. It was a time when he bounced around from place to place, desperately searching for where he belonged. His rebellious streak was growing, and it led him to live with various relatives and family friends. He would spend some time with his mom in Aberdeen, and then with his friend Jesse Reed's family. During this period, he even tried going Christian for a while, but like most things in Kurt's life, it didn't really stick. These constant changes, new homes, shifting beliefs only added to his feelings of being lost, and he struggled against authority, feeling more like an outsider wherever he went. But during these chaotic years, music was the one thing Kurt could always rely on. At 14 years old, he got his first guitar, and it was like a spark had been lit. He dove in head first, starting with covers of Zeppelin and the Cars, and it didn't take long before Kurt began crafting his own songs, pouring his heart and soul into them. But there was a problem. He couldn't find anybody to play with. No one around him seemed to share his same drive, and that just made him feel more alone, like this musical fire was just kind of burning in isolation. And then came the moment that changed everything. Kurt stumbled into the growing punk rock scene in Seattle, and it was like stepping into a whole new world. The shows were raw, the energy was electric, and the DIY ethos was something that Kurt could really get behind. And it wasn't just music, it was a community, a place where his growing frustration and anger finally had somewhere to go. And this was also where Kurt met Krist Novoselic, a like-minded soul who would eventually become the bassist for Nirvana. And they crossed paths at a band called the Melvins Practice Space, and this band was basically the heartbeat of the Seattle punk scene at the time. And this was the start of something big, and Kurt could feel it. By the late 80s, Kurt Cobain's life was a cocktail of chaos, creativity, and an obsession with music that refused to let go. He had dropped out of high school and was drifting, sometimes with nowhere to call home. And there's even the infamous story of Kurt living under a bridge, a story that became a core part of his mythology. But if you ask Krist Novoselic, it wasn't quite as dramatic as Kurt liked to make it sound. Still though, Kurt was living on the edge, scraping by with odd jobs in order to survive. At one point, he even found himself working at a Polynesian resort. Sounds more like a fever dream than reality. Definitely a bizarre chapter in Kurt's unpredictable life. But in the midst of all this newfound chaos, Kurt found an unexpected lifeline, a woman named Tracy Miranda, who he met on his visits to Olympia, Washington. Tracy was like an anchor for Kurt. She had a steady job and offered him a sense of stability that he really needed at the time. She supported them both financially, which allowed Kurt to focus on his music. But even with Tracy's emotional support, Kurt felt lost. He wasn't cut out for this conventional life. He couldn't see himself settling down, working a regular job, living that kind of life that most people considered normal. His heart belonged to music, and that single-minded obsession often caused friction between them. And that strain of the financial situation and Kurt's relentless drive to create seeped into his songwriting. The song About a Girl from Nirvana's debut album was born out of this tension, a raw reflection of Tracy's unwavering love, Kurt's frustrations, and the sacrifices they both had to make in order to keep their heads above water. Musically, Kurt's partnership with Krist Novoselic started to come together in a big way. In Olympia, Washington, they decided to form a band. First, they called themselves the Stiff Woodies. But then they would rename this band to Skid Row. There were many bands that had taken on this name in one shape or form, but there was only one, the Sebastian Bach-led one, that really took shape. But they're drawing inspiration from the heavy riffs of Black Sabbath and the raw aggression of punk bands like Black Flag. By 1986, they had landed on the new name, Nirvana. It was ironic almost, considering how chaotic their lives were at the time, but it spoke to something that Kurt was searching for, a sense of peace in all the noise. The early days were a mess. Drummers came and went like a revolving door, but by 1988, they finally had some stability when Chad Channing joined the group. That same year, they moved to Seattle, ground zero for the emerging grunge movement, and they signed with Sub Pop Records. Sub Pop, known for its gritty, do-it-yourself attitude, was instrumental in helping Nirvana release their debut single, a cover of Shocking Blue's Love Buzz. It was raw, loud, and exactly what they needed to make their mark. In 1989, Nirvana released their debut album, Bleach. It was recorded with producer Jack Endino for just $606.17, a shoestring budget that perfectly matched the unpolished, heavy sound that they were going for. And Kirk's lyrics were really relatable, expressing feelings of isolation and frustration that so many people could relate to at the time. Bleach didn't break into the mainstream, but it definitely made waves in the underground scene, selling 40,000 copies through word of mouth alone. Critics took notice too, praising the band's raw energy during live performances, even if Kurt's ability to sing and play guitar at the time wasn't exactly perfect. But that was what made it work. Nirvana wasn't about perfection, they were about raw, unfiltered emotion. And they were building a reputation for their live shows, frenetic, chaotic, and often destructive. Feedback blared, guitars screamed, and by the end of the set, the stage was often in shambles, with smashed instruments littering the floor. Kurt Cobain would often just throw himself right into the drum set. And they were following in the footsteps of bands like The Who, taking the concept of destructive energy to the next level. The young crowds just ate it up. Clad in ripped jeans and flannel shirts, they came to see Nirvana because it felt real. It wasn't about flashy production or stadium lights. It was about connecting through the raw power of music. And Sub Pop had a knack for stirring up the buzz, and in one smart marketing move, they flew an influential British rock critic to Seattle to cover the scene that was brewing there. It worked. Suddenly, the eyes of the world were on Seattle, and Nirvana was one of the bands leading the charge. Bleach may not have been a commercial hit, but it was the spark that started that fire. But as Nirvana's star began to rise, the cracks were starting to show. By 1990, during the recording sessions with producer Butch Vig, tensions within the band were reaching a boiling point. Kurt and Krist were growing frustrated with Chad's drumming, and Chad meanwhile felt creatively stifled and wanted more say in the band's direction, something that just was not happening. And eventually the tension became too much and Chad just left the band. The search for a new drummer was not easy. They tried out several people, including Mudhoney's Dan Peters, and even brought back Dale Crover for a tour. But nothing clicked until September of 1990 when Buzz Osborne from the Melvins introduced them to Dave Grohl. Dave had come off a stint with his band Scream when he auditioned for Nirvana, and it was like lightning in a bottle. As Krist later said, "We knew in 2 minutes he was the right drummer." Grohl brought that power and intensity that they needed. He wasn't just a drummer, he was a missing piece of the puzzle. With Dave on board, Nirvana was finally complete and they were ready for the next chapter, one that would change everything. Their next move would be the big breakthrough, recording and releasing Nevermind, the album that blew up and catapulted Nirvana into international stardom almost overnight. But Kurt, having experienced the ups and downs of working with Sub Pop, was wary of signing with a major label. He knew the risks of losing creative control, and that concern weighed heavily on his mind. It influenced everything from their choice of producer, Butch, to the direction that they wanted to take their music. But Butch Vig had already earned the band's respect during the 1999 Smart Studio demos. His ability to capture Nirvana's raw energy while seeing their potential for a more polished sound made him the ideal fit. Kurt Cobain really appreciated how Vig could balance their punk roots with a sound that was, dare he say it, a bit pop. It was a blend that would define Nevermind, a collision of gritty rebellion and undeniable hooks. But even with the new energy found with Dave Grohl, Kurt still faced creative tension. He was torn between his punk rock instincts and that growing interest in exploring more melodic, accessible sounds. But despite his image as a troubled artist, Kurt was actually a really shrewd songwriter. He knew how to craft a hit. His lyrics, introspective and abstract, connected deeply with listeners who felt lost or out of place. He was even hailed as a pop genius, a nod to his ability to channel raw emotion into something commercially viable. In classic Kurt fashion, he often finalized his lyrics at the last possible moment before recording. Now, the recording sessions for Nevermind took place at Sound City Studios in Los Angeles. It was a huge shift from Butch Vig's usual Madison studio, and the change of environment ended up playing a part in shaping the album's sound. For 2 months, the band worked tirelessly, laying down tracks, experimenting, and perfecting things. Some of the songs like In Bloom and Breed had been staples of their live sets for a few years by this time. Others like On a Plane, Stay Away were still being fleshed out lyrically and musically. But this mix of old and new material showcased just how far the band had come by this time. But no matter how much they worked to perfect their sound, Kurt was never completely satisfied. When Andy Wallace came in to mix the album, he polished it in a way that made it more accessible, and while that helped launch Nirvana into the mainstream, Kurt felt like the raw energy had just been lost. It wasn't what their live shows were about, it was more refined, more commercial, and that nagging feeling of compromise would stay with Kurt. And then, of course, there was Smells Like Teen Spirit. Kurt always downplayed the song's lyrical depth, but it became the anthem of a generation. That iconic guitar riff, driven by power chords and paired with Kurt's raw, gravelly voice, struck a chord with millions of people. Interestingly enough, that chord progression of that song sounds almost like a direct rip from Blue Oyster Cult's Godzilla, but it was removed enough to be its own, but yet still familiar enough to a past hit that it could just instantly click in listeners' minds. Now, the thing is, nobody expected this song to blow up the way it did. Not Kurt, not Krist, not even Dave. But it did, and suddenly Nirvana was everywhere. And the success of Smells Like Teen Spirit amplified the pressures Kurt was already feeling. He really wanted the music to speak for itself, but not the fame that followed, and it turned out to be really suffocating. From the moment Nevermind dropped in September of 1991, everything changed for Nirvana. In the blink of an eye, they went from an underground grunge band to international superstars. But with that unexpected global success came intense media scrutiny, relentless touring, and a whole lot of personal turmoil, especially for Kurt Cobain. This was also a time when Kurt's escalating drug use was spiraling out of control, and his relationship with Courtney Love, the lead singer of Hole, had become a constant source of headlines by this time. Fame wasn't all that it was cracked up to be, and the band found themselves in a battle against their own success, grappling with internal tensions and Kurt's increasingly public struggles. To put it in perspective as to how big this album was, it dethroned Michael Jackson's Dangerous from the top of the Billboard 200. People called it astonishing, world-dominating success, and it really was, but it was completely overwhelming for the entire group. And his meteoric rise to fame also came with another brutal price, an exhausting touring schedule that just never seemed to end. They hit the road hard, crisscrossing the US, Europe, and Australia, playing to increasingly massive, wild crowds. The band's first Australian tour in 1992 was supposed to be laid back, and they were actually booked to do this tour by Steven Pavlovic before Nevermind even was recorded, but it never took shape. The band was encouraged to get with a bigger promoter, but they really liked Steven, so they just went with him. The only thing is, he just lined up all these really tiny venues, and because of that, the tour turned into complete chaos. Every venue was easily sold out, with lines going around the building. Nirvana's live shows were just pure raw chaos, unfiltered energy that made their performances legendary. But behind the scenes, Kurt Cobain was struggling. The relentless touring, the constant travel, the never-ending barrage of media interviews all started to wear him down. And the expectations from the growing fan base also seemed overwhelming, with the pressures of fame just completely closing them in. The band members felt the enormous pressure of being the world's most famous rock group and couldn't stand the invasive journalism that was coming with it. Well, Kurt Cobain was no stranger to pain. Throughout his life, he dealt with chronic bronchitis and mysterious stomach pains that no doctor could seem to diagnose. These physical issues were just the beginning, and he was also doing battle with mental and emotional stuff. So as Nirvana's fame was skyrocketing, so did his struggles with drug use. The success of Nevermind brought with it unimaginable pressure, and Kurt turned to heroin as a way to cope. And what started out as a means to dull the pain soon spiraled out of control, especially with the relentless demands of touring and the constant spotlight on his every move. So during this 1992 Australian tour, Kurt Cobain faced severe withdrawal symptoms. Desperate for relief from his stomach pains and drug withdrawals, he seriously considered canceling the rest of the tour. It was only after getting reassurance and support from the tour crew that he managed to push through and actually finish it. And Kurt Cobain's drug use took a heavy toll on his relationship with Courtney Love. This relationship, which began in 1990, was a whirlwind, intense and fueled by the love for music and shared struggles with addiction. The drugs, as in any case, brought a lot of problems. In February of 1992, despite all this chaos, they got married in Hawaii, while Love was pregnant with their daughter, Frances Bean Cobain. And that turned out to be a moment of hope in the middle of all the turmoil that was going on. But despite all the chaos in his personal life, Kurt Cobain never stopped making music. Even as his world seemed to be crumbling, he kept writing and performing with Nirvana. In December of '92, the band had released Insecticide, a compilation album filled with B-sides, demos, and covers. It was raw, messy, and exactly what Kurt Cobain wanted to give to the fans. And really, it was just a way to remind everybody of Nirvana's roots, an alternative to the polished sound of Nevermind. It was also Kurt's way of pushing back against the commercialization of the music and staying true more to those punk ethos that had shaped him. The band's mainstream success was a double-edged sword for Kurt. On one hand, he had always wanted the recognition, but on the other, he struggled with the pressure to conform. And he was starting to feel like a sellout, even though deep down he knew that he had always aimed for something bigger. By the time they were gearing up to record In Utero, Kurt had had enough of the polished, radio-friendly sound of Nevermind. He wanted a full album that was raw and abrasive and that would reflect the chaos that he was feeling at the time. In a 1993 interview, Cobain made it clear that he wanted to push the boundaries with In Utero. He said the lyrics were more focused, more built on themes. It was his way of challenging the audience, daring them to embrace a sound that was raw and unrefined, far from the polished feel of Nevermind. And this reflected Kurt's internal struggle. He wanted to stay true to that artistic integrity, but the pressures of mainstream success were always there, always pulling him in a different direction. But now, Nirvana was faced with this daunting task of following up an album that had defined an entire generation. Enter Steve Albini, the perfect foil for Kurt's discontent with all things commercialization. Albini was a legend in the indie scene, the guy who didn't care about making things commercially appealing. He really went for that stripped-down production style. And moreover, he kind of played as sort of a liaison between bands and the labels. In this way, labels can feel all warm and fuzzy knowing that they have a producer, when meanwhile Steve would go in and say, okay, what do you guys want? And I'll make it happen. So Nirvana recorded In Utero in just 2 weeks at Pachyderm Studio in Minnesota. And the sessions were intense, urgent, and really quite messy. They'd lay down all the instrumental tracks first, with Kurt potentially not even singing live during the initial takes. But it was all about capturing that unfiltered chaos, exactly what Kurt needed to express the turmoil that he was feeling during that time. In Utero hit like a freight train. It was raw, loud, and unapologetic, far cry from the polished, more accessible sound of Nevermind. Songs like Scentless Apprentice, with those jagged riffs and guttural screams, and Milk It, which was practically a wall of noise and distorted vocals, showed a band that wasn't interested in playing it safe. Kurt's lyrics were cryptic, dark and unsettling, diving deep into themes of alienation, despair, and his messy relationship with fame. And then there was Heart-Shaped Box, the lead single, a haunting melody paired with surreal lyrics that hinted at the darkness lurking just beneath the surface. It was a perfect glimpse of Kurt's songwriting genius, wrapped in a package that was equally parts beautiful and disturbing. Well, the abrasive sound and raw lyrics of In Utero sent the record label into a panic. The label feared the album was unreleasable and worried that it would alienate mainstream audiences. And Kurt was going for broke. He even said during an interview during this period that he really wanted to literally mic up a boombox and let that be the final mastering process, which would then be released. But cooler heads at the label, of course, prevailed. Nevertheless, this clash of artistic vision and commercial pressure led to serious tension between the band and the label. And Kurt, always wary of the music industry's control, found himself once again fighting the very machine that had launched them into the spotlight. But despite the pushback, In Utero was released with some changes, but overall, definitely a lot more raw than Nevermind. And the creation of the album was definitely a turbulent process, mirroring the chaos in Kurt's personal life. His marriage to Courtney Love was intense and constantly under the microscope of the media, and their relationship began to fray under the strain of addiction and outside pressure. When their daughter was born in 1992, it brought a mix of joy and heightened anxiety for Kurt. He was struggling with the responsibilities of fatherhood while battling his own demons, and that turmoil definitely bled its way into the music. Tracks like All Apologies and Pennyroyal Tea captured that raw vulnerability and pain that was defining this chapter in his life. But the band had the last laugh. When In Utero debuted at #1 on the charts, it was proof that Nirvana's unfiltered approach was still resonating deeply with listeners. Critics loved it, praising the raw energy and intensity, seeing it as a bold, artistic move by the band. Cobain had hoped that the abrasive sound might scare off some of their more casual fans, but instead the album achieved multi-platinum success. It seemed like no matter how hard he tried, Kurt could not shake the massive spotlight that had been thrust upon him. But In Utero's success couldn't hide the darkness that was closing in on Kurt Cobain. The album was both a critical and commercial victory, but behind the music was a man teetering on the edge, caught in a battle against demons that were slowly taking over. It was a haunting glimpse into the struggles that Kurt faced, all forces that were ultimately beyond his control. The 1993 tour supporting Nirvana's In Utero was pure chaos, and the band really found themselves at a critical juncture, caught between skyrocketing fame and the darkness of Kurt Cobain's spiraling personal issues. Despite critical acclaim and massive commercial success, the tour was plagued by Cobain's deteriorating health, driven by a renewed addiction. The In Utero tour kicked off in October of 1993, signaling Nirvana's return to the chaos of large-scale touring after a deliberate break following the massive success of Nevermind. Now with Pat Smear joining on rhythm guitar, Nirvana was back, but it wasn't all glory. The tour schedule was brutal, taking them across the US and Europe. On stage, they were electrifying, pure grunge energy, but behind the scenes, Kurt's condition was unraveling, casting a dark shadow over everything. March of 1994, in Rome, this is where things truly took a dark turn. Kurt Cobain was found unconscious after ODing on a cocktail of Rohypnol and alcohol. At first, everybody thought it was just an accident, a tragic mix-up of prescriptions, but then Courtney Love dropped a bombshell. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional. A definite urge to call it quits, she said. It was a chilling moment that foreshadowed everything that was to come and led to an abrupt cancellation of the rest of Nirvana's European tour. And this was the very moment when Kurt Cobain's decline became impossible to ignore. His instability was obvious to his bandmates, his family, and his friends. He was struggling, battling addiction, chronic pain, and crushing weight of fame, and the people closest to him were stunned by just how far he was falling. Michael Azerrad, who was writing a biography of the band, shared a chilling story. In 1993, he got a frantic call from Courtney Love. Cobain had locked himself in a room with a weapon, and he was threatening to end it right then and there. Michael urged Courtney to call the police, and then he called Nirvana's management himself. He was worried sick about Kurt having access to such a dangerous thing given his fragile state. The manager's response? I'll take care of it. And it was meant to be reassuring, but it only added to that growing sense of dread. Even with everything falling apart around him, Kurt Cobain never stopped creating. He was actually planning a project with his close friend Dylan Carlson, the same friend who, just before the horrible event, bought him the infamous piece that would put an end to everything. Kurt had wanted to record a collection of Leadbelly covers with Carlson, and it was kept secret, maybe because Kurt feared backlash from the industry. But this small haunting detail captures Cobain's inner conflict perfectly. He was torn between his love for music and the suffocating alienation brought on by fame. It's this haunting contrast, the artist who kept dreaming even while preparing for the very end, that makes this story so chilling. But if you think that was the end of the story, you'd be mistaken. Questions about what really happened had never gone away. When a band as iconic as Nirvana ends in tragedy, people don't want to believe the official story. There's something about it that just doesn't sit right. How could somebody who gave us so much be struggling that deeply? Naturally, of course, conspiracy theories began swirling. Some claimed foul play, others insisted there had to be more to the story. Danny Goldberg, Nirvana's former manager, called these theories ludicrous. He said Kurt just simply did the deed. He was battling addiction, chronic pain, and the pressures of fame, and that the tragedy of the loss is so great that people are always looking for other explanations. But even after everything, Cobain's influence is undeniable. He wasn't just a musician. He was the voice of a generation that felt lost, unheard, and alienated. His raw honesty, both in his music and his life, completely redefined rock music. And that was really the big takeaway, is that Kurt Cobain inspired artists to be unapologetically real, to embrace their flaws, and to turn their pain into something powerful. And even though he's gone, his presence is still felt. His music speaks directly to those who feel misunderstood, those searching for something genuine and something real. Kurt Cobain left behind a legacy that will never fade. Something really weird I just found out. The most expensive guitar on Amazon is a signature guitar, and you won't believe whose signature guitar it is. I left the link below in the description. And to my subscribers, I really want to thank you so much for all the inspiration and feedback. I truly do appreciate it. And if you haven't had a chance to subscribe to this channel, make sure you smack that subscribe button. While you're at it, hit the like button, join the family, and I want to thank you so much for watching.